On today's podcast, we tell you a story involving one of the largest coal operations in Southwest Virginia and the disappearance of the son of its principal owner in Wise County, Virginia at the turn of the 20th century. Hello, podcast listeners and YouTube viewers. I'm Steve Gilley along with Rod Mullins, and you're watching Stories, A History of Appalachia.
Steve, this is an interesting story, to say the least. When we start talking about Westmoreland coal and we start talking about the early days of coal mining in Southwest Virginia and Appalachia, for example, we hear a lot of names, or we see a lot of names that, well, to me, I guess it's the same way as you, brings back a lot of memories about certain things. But this takes it a little step further and talks a little bit about some interesting things, some mysterious things that happened when all of this was just getting started in the area.
After the Civil War, a prominent Pennsylvania coal baron named John Lessenring, on behalf of his Pennsylvania Coal Company, bought 150,000 acres in far southwest Virginia that contained vast coal reserves. He later was forced to sell his Pennsylvania assets to his main competitors, Andrew Carnegie and Henry Clay Frick.
Lessenring managed the company until its sale, and upon his death, his nephews, Edward and Daniel Wentz, came to Southwest Virginia to run the company, which was incorporated at the Virginia Coal and Iron Company, or as some people would refer to it as VIC or VICC, on January 6, 1882. Now, the company originally was headquartered in Big Stone Gap, but then was shortly moved to Stonega, Virginia. Now, Stonega, Steve, got its name from Big Stone Gap by dropping the Big and joining Stone and Gap together, and then later on dropping the P. So the Stonega operations had a different corporate structure and was known as the Stonega Coke and Coal Company. Stonega ran the day-to-day operations of mining, while Virginia Coal was the parent company. Virginia Coal and Iron Company held over 100,000 acres of land in Virginia and Kentucky alone.
Definitely one of the biggest landowners in southwest Virginia and eastern Kentucky. That's true. Well, the company guarded their properties closely, Rod. They also engaged in some, well, how shall we say, underhanded tactics to get their hands on coal land. For example, if families couldn't produce a printed deed for their property, well, the company wasn't beneath throwing them off the land that it claimed by whatever deed it could get its hands on. It didn't matter if these families had been living on that land for generations. They were labeled squatters and kicked out. Company officials had their land patrolled and would have people arrested for trespassing if they found them gathering nuts, firewood, hunting, or producing moonshine.
Sounds like something from the old feudal system from back in the Dark Ages.
That is exactly what it is. In fact, I think these men wanted to have a feudal system over the Appalachian folks in this part of the country. Well, the moonshine operations were viewed by the company as the worst, okay? They didn't want their employees drinking, as they saw that producing an inefficient labor force. In fact, when a coal company would move into an area, Rod, they would declare the region dry with the help of their paid-for officials, of course, and alcohol would no longer be legal.
Wow.
Well, that brings us to 1903 and our story. Dr. John S. Wentz was one of the principal owners of the Virginia Coal and Iron Company. He had two sons, one of whom, Daniel, was made the president of the Stonega operations, and the other, Edward, who had just completed his studies in Pennsylvania and apparently had a great desire to relocate to Big Stone Gap. Well, at 25, Edward Lessenring Wentz was independently wealthy and actually semi-famous, okay? So the national media buzzed with gossip about why such a man would want to move to the hills of Appalachia. Dr. Wentz made Edward the general manager of the Stonega Company and the Virginia Coal and Coke Company in Virginia. Now here, Rod, is where it begins to get a little strange, or I guess when you talk about the wealthy, one should use the term, what, eccentric?
Mm-hmm.
Well, Edward, as manager of Stonega/Virginia Coal and Iron, decided that instead of hiring a force of security professionals to patrol the company lands, why, heck, he'd just do that himself personally. And that's just what he did.
Wow. Well, Wentz then chased trespassers off, physically threw them off of the company lands, and according to reports, He almost sounded like what we refer to as, somebody walking tall, carrying a big stick to a certain degree. He would actually punish those mountaineers he came across by whipping them with not a stick, but a whip. Now, according to the newspapers, Wentz was determined to bend them, the locals, to his will. Now, their description of all this almost sounds sadistic, and I guess you'd have to wonder if he wasn't simply a psychopath in rich men's clothing. And he also made himself land agent for the company and thus demanded rent from neighboring landowners who couldn't produce the proper paperwork, throwing them off the land if they didn't pay and taking it for the coal company.
Well, now, Wentz also, Rod, became a member of the Big Stone Gap Police Guard, or the Vigilantes, as they were known in the area.
Whoa.
Oh, yeah. This group, sanctioned by Virginia law to help prevent lynchings, manage crowds at large trials, and functions as executioners, was organized by Joshua Bullitt, who just so happened to be what, Rod?
The coal company attorney.
Whose practice was located in Big Stone Gap. Here's an interesting side note, too, Rod. Mr. Bullitt's name is still alive and well in the town of Big Stone Gap as the Union Bears play in a park that bears his name, known as Bullitt Park.
And Steve, there would be some sports fans out there that would say that there's been always controversy exist at Bullitt Park.
Yes, indeed. In any event, in his position with the Vigilantes, Edward Wentz took on what apparently was his biggest passion, other than whipping mountaineers with a whip, finding and destroying moonshine stills. And he didn't care if they were on company property or not. Well, one such raid happened just a few weeks before he disappeared. Wentz and his group had found a still in the mountains being run by one James Daniels. During that raid, Daniels was seriously wounded by gunfire, and Wentz's men took him not to the local hospital, Rod, but to Stonega and the company hospital, where nobody, including Daniels' family, including his own mother, was allowed to see him as he lay dying. In fact, his mother charged the hospital with torturing James Daniels to death.
Wow.
Now that gets us to October 13th, 1903. On that day, Wentz played tennis with his friend John Goodloe. The next day, he telephoned his assistant to tell him that he was going up the river to deliver eviction notices and warrants to trespassers, another one of his favorite activities. Edward Wentz got on his horse on the 14th, left his home riding through Kelly View, and that was the last time he was ever seen alive.
Well, Steve, the horse was later found wandering in the road near Ramsey Creek Ford, and Daniel Wentz was notified. At that point, all the Virginia coal and iron resources were poured into finding Edward Wentz. The mines were shut down. Every miner and mine employee was sent out to join in the search, which went on for over a month. Now, you have to ask yourself the question, too, how many of these miners were really serious about finding Edward Wentz out there in the wilderness? Well, we don't know, but bloodhounds were brought in to find the Wentz heir, but to no avail. The family even hired detectives, and they even had a reward set at $50,000, unheard of at the time at the turn of the century. Even Big Stone Gap writer John Fox Jr., a personal friend of Edwards, joined in the search. The reward eventually doubled to $100,000. Now, the search even ran way into Kentucky, but no body was ever found or any evidence to suggest what had ever happened to it.
Well, keep in mind, Rod, this wasn't just some small-town Appalachian mystery. Newspapers from San Francisco to Chicago to New York City covered the case. There were hoax ransom letters that were quickly dismissed, and that's when something turned up. One day in Big Stone Gap, a well-dressed, eloquent young man strode confidently into the Wentz offices and told them that he knew the kidnappers and that they demanded $25,000 in ransom money for Edward Wentz. Well, Dr. Wentz quickly agreed, but he wanted proof before handing over the money. I guess you could see that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe a personal item or something written by his son. Well, the stranger left, promising to return with something. The coal company sent someone to follow him, and they did, at least till he turned up into the mountains and disappeared, never to be seen again. Well, as time passed, even the newspapers turned against the Wentz family, making fun of them, ridiculing him. They stopped talking to the press. Then, the following spring, May 9th, 1904, while out looking for a lost cow, a Pardee miner named David Raleigh came across a partially decomposed body wearing the same kind of fancy clothing that Edward Wentz wore. He contacted company officials, and Joshua Bullitt led a group of the vigilantes to the site to guard the body until it could be recovered and sent to Wise. It was expected that Raleigh would get the $100,000 reward and become a very rich man, but no, Rod. The company,
of course not.
Yeah, no, the company reneged on the reward, offering only $5,000 and only upon a conviction of whoever it was that would have done this to Edward.
Mm-hmm.
To this day, we have no idea if Mr. Raleigh ever got a penny of that money.
Well, guess what, Steve? This is where it's going to get weird again. Now, remember all the army of miners that they sent out to comb the area in the previous fall? Well, the body was found only 1 mile from where his horse was found on Ramsey Creek. Now, in spite of thousands of searchers and tens of thousands of man-hours, no one saw anything there. In fact, the man responsible for searching that area of Ramsey Creek, William Hayes, emphatically denied finding anything at all in that area and that his crew had covered it thoroughly.
Well, when Wentz's body was found, it appeared to have been burnt in places, consistent with a recent forest fire. A pearl button was found on the ground next to the body, but no one thought to try to locate the owner, although it was identified as belonging to women's clothing, which could have some bearing in this case. According to Joshua Bullitt, who represented the Wentz family at the inquest in Wise, his examination of the scene indicated that Edward Wentz struggled with a group of outlaws, and that there were 3 shells fired from Wentz's gun. Now, Bullitt's theory was that Daniel's family, or associates, had killed him as revenge for that raid on his still a few weeks earlier, the one we talked about.
Right.
Daniel Wentz agreed with Bullitt's theory. The results of the autopsy, though, showed that Wentz's right hand was missing, probably gnawed off by an animal. It also showed that there were several holes in the clothing and that the body had a single bullet wound, a .32 caliber, which entered the front of the body and passed through the heart, settling near the spine. Now, there were powder burns, indicating the shot was fired at close range. He was found to have died from blood loss. Oddly, though, it was found that after being shot, Wentz fell onto his back because blood had pooled in the back of the body. However, the body was found in a half-seated position against a log.
Well, other theories ranged from suicide, of course, to kidnapping and execution to just outright murder. And the Kingston, Tennessee Daily Freeman reported that on May 11, 1904, that 2 men being held in Knoxville, Tennessee on unrelated charges of robbery were suspected of murdering Edward Wentz. Their homes were searched and some clothing covered with blood were found which resembled clothes worn by Wentz when he disappeared. There was also an English riding coat of the same kind worn by Wentz. It turned out that they were members of a gang, the Wright Templeton Gang. I've not heard that name in a long time, which had dealings with Edward Wentz, who had run them off company property for moonshining.
It also turned out, Rod, that Edward Wentz had a sweetheart. His family, as well as the rest of the country, was shocked to learn that at the time of his death, Wentz had been engaged to a Cornelia Brookmeyer of St. Louis for almost a year. Now, Brookmeyer had been friends with Wentz's sister-in-law for years, but the family objected to Edward's relationship with her, so he apparently kept it a secret. She was, by the way, an independently wealthy woman herself. After the body was found, Ms. Brookmeyer came to Big Stone Gap and stayed at Edward's house for almost a month, wearing full mourning garb. She would talk about strange personal behavior by Wentz, including keeping the relationship hush-hush. She said they were formally engaged the previous summer of 1903, and that he suddenly then showed no more interest in her or their wedding plans upon the engagement. Then the family got the biggest shock, Rod. When they opened Edward's safe, they found his will and found that he had left his entire fortune to Ms. Brookmeyer.
Well, in the end, the 2 outlaws, Silas Eisen and Tom Wright, were arrested and brought back to Wise to face murder charges. But the coroner's jury ended up returning a verdict of, get this, Steve, accidental shooting. Sounds convenient, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
And when the Wentz family came to Wise County to retrieve the body, they made a lot of noise about the injustice of the verdict, but they simply just didn't pursue an appeal or take their own course of action. They simply chartered a private train to take Edward's body home for burial.
Wow, Steve, just a mystery within itself. And just when you think that you had something solved, you find out that, well, maybe it's not so solved, or at least in one way, because, the body was there in one spot, showed signs of being burned. Wow, this is just an interesting story. And to beat all, too, it made headlines. It made headlines from beyond Southwest Virginia and
Yes,
Big
it
Stone
did.
Gap. It went national, probably along the lines of international as well.
Well, you're talking about a 120-year-old murder mystery in the coalfields of Appalachia. And as I was researching this podcast, I came across several different stories, which indicates that things back then, as far as the media were concerned, weren't a whole lot different than today. For example, there was a news story that came out of Bristol. It was unattributed, other than sources in Bristol said that they had actually found Mr. Wentz in a cabin up where the West Virginia border in Buchanan County, not too far from Grundy, and that Joshua Bullitt had led a raid on the cabin, got him out. He was crazy when they got him out. They put him on a train, heading him to Cincinnati. And that was the news for about 2 or 3 weeks in December of that year.
Wow.
Until finally somebody said, you know what, the train never showed up. And they finally said, well, we didn't find him. And it wasn't until later that next spring that they actually came across his body in the woods.
It's almost like fake news, so to speak. I mean, you're generating news out there. Well, let's say it that way. You were generating news to sell copy. That's what you were trying to do, to sell copies of the newspaper. And however you got it, one way or the other, it was either true or false. But that's just amazing that, back in those days. And we've talked about this before. What about, the newspapers and so forth of the time? And I remember, I think you mentioned it one time before that, a lot of these places, they got their news from smaller independent places like Middlesboro,
Yes.
Bristol, and places like that. So the New York Times was probably picking stuff up from maybe a reporter that was dispatched out of Middlesboro, maybe covering this story, or so to speak. And that's how this stuff got popular and was able to be spread all across the United States.
Well, they weren't checking their sources.
Right.
They're just taking one little story that they heard from somewhere in Bristol, Tennessee, and just magnified it all over the world, raising false hopes, pretty much.
Well, and that's where we got the term back in those days, yellow journalism.
Yes,
so to
absolutely.
speak. So, I mean, we're in this same day and time, not long afterwards, but how many of you remember the Maine? So that's the start of some of this stuff. So we're kind of snowballing a little bit more into the modern press and so forth, how it kind of moved into the 20th and then the 21st century.
And folks, that's the mystery of the death of Edward Wentz. Another one of the stories that we tell right here on Stories, A History of Appalachia. We appreciate you watching. Now, we'd love it if you'd subscribe to the podcast. We'd also like it if you'd hit that like button down there and tell your friends about us. Till next we meet, y'all take care. So long, everybody.
See ya.